Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin, and it is with a heavy heart and a deep sense of regret that I inform you that it is, in fact, an LGA Day. Now, what is an LGA Day? You would very well be forgiven for pondering. Well, an LGA Day, to me, means a lanky gray alien day. Ever since I was young, I had these dreams. Well, so not really dreams, I guess, because I was always awake. So daydreams, I guess. Or unsolicited imaginations, maybe, of these creatures that I always refer to as lanky gray aliens. And even to this day, I don't particularly like thinking about them, or remembering them, because these little daymares really frightened me as a boy. Far less now, but I still envisioned them from time to time, and almost without exception, on gray, cloudy, sunless days. The lanky gray aliens kind of remind me of lizard or geese people, which may sound whimsical, but it's not. I suppose their most prominent feature is their height. They push 9 or 10 feet, but a lot of that is neck. Their bodies are similar in height to that of an average man. The rest is this weird neck that slopes forward at an uncomfortable angle, which I always associated to be like a swan, even though it's not. It's actually not like that at all. Really, it's the opposite. The lanky gray alien's neck just slopes forward. There's no double bend like with a bird. Or the human spinal column, for that matter. It's not using gravity to its advantage, so they have to hold their heads up purely by muscle, which is odd because they don't strike me as muscular. And as laughable as this sounds, I've always assumed that they're built like this because gravity is different wherever they're from. Their heads are round and small, and they have virtually no jawline. It's just round like a circle. They don't have teeth, just toughened gums, or that's what it looks like to me, where our teeth are. They have wide mouths. They don't really have lips. It's just like this callus around their mouth that seem to be made out of the same scaly stuff that their gums or their teeth are made out of. And though they don't really have lips, their mouths are still quite expressive, which is quite unlike a reptile. They have wrinkles, like crow's feet, I think they're called, from the corner of their mouths to the corner of their eyes. Their eyes are almond-shaped and almond-colored, and not very different from ours. And they have no hair. They have no hair, but they don't seem like the type of thing that would be hairless. So I wouldn't be surprised if they have peach fuzz or something like that. Like an elephant. Their skin looks rather elephantine. Somewhere between an elephant and a monitor lizard, though there's no scales. And they seem like they have really long arms, but they don't, technically speaking. The length from shoulder to elbow is actually shorter, in proportion to that of a human. And I think their elbow to wrist is actually about the same as that of a person. But their hands and fingers are enormous. Their hands, including fingers, are easily as long as their whole forearms, if not longer. So look at the length of arm between your elbow and your wrist. Now imagine that your hands and fingers are that long. That's what they're like. So this makes it seem like they have long arms, but really they just have long hands. Strangely enough, I can't really recall any definition below the waist. And I don't know if it's because I've never focused on it, or if because the view is often obstructed, but I can't really detail their legs or anything. And I suppose my imagination never really figured that out. This illustration I directed shows it as wispy, like a ghost, but that's not really what I recall. It's just to indicate that I don't really know. Their countenance is very much that of something wanting something, or trying to do something but can't, like frustrated. They have very expressive lips. But their behavior really reminds me of an iguana wanting to be fed, as far as their neutral appearance goes. Though perhaps I draw the iguana comparison because they have a slight spinal ridge running across their creepy hump backs, and that reminds me of an iguana I once knew named Albert. And though these waking imaginations definitely used to frighten me when I was a child, I always understood that these figments seem to have rules. It's not something I learned, it's almost like I knew it intuitively. They never seemed to come too close, and they always kept at least one boundary away. So if I was in the backyard, they stayed behind the fence. If I was in my bedroom with the door open, they were in the hall. If I was beneath the covers, they were outside the blankets. Which on the one hand was terrifying, but in a strange pragmatic way was actually quite empowering to my young imagination. No matter what I was doing or where I was, they could come close, yet could never get to me, though not for want of trying, and that seemed to make them angry. And in case I'm being unclear, let me give an example of an encounter. I'd be raking leaves or something. Then I'd get this chill that had naught to do with the bitter wind. Then I'd think, what if one of those things was right behind the fence? And though I thought, what if, I always knew it was actually there, the feeling was palpable. And though I'd never want to look, I'd force myself to slowly and stoically face the direction of the feeling of the hateful gaze. And sure enough, one would be there as I knew it would. And I should mention that not seeing them was not evidence of absence. But when I did see them, I could blink a bunch of times and think of something else, and refocus on an arguable reality. And then I could no longer perceive them, but I knew that that by no means meant they were gone. Only about 10% of the time would there be more than one of them. This weird imaginative quirk never left me, even now as an adult, whenever it's a gray and overcast day, and there's just a weird vibe, the kind of day I want to watch a horror movie and chill. I call it a lanky gray alien day, because that's when I imagine they're about. And so, here's the part I've never told anyone, and I don't really know why I've never told anyone this, and I'm not really sure why I feel inclined to share it here. But this is really the only part of all of this that really, really makes my hair stand up. It truly freaks me out in a super duper weird way that I can't really articulate. And frankly, I don't even like to think about it, but here it goes. I don't remember my age, but based on some context I'll get to in a minute, I know I was 13 when this happened. When I had this dream. And I have no memory of how the dream started. It was like I entered it halfway through. But in the dream, I'm sitting upright in my bed, and this vintage rocking chair that was in my room forever was pulled up to my bed. And sitting there was William Moseley, though of course at the time I knew him as Peter Pevensey, the King of Narnia. And that's why I think I was 13. This must have been shortly after I saw The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in theaters. So at the beginning of 2004. And that's why dreams are so fun. You wake up and the King of Narnia is 3 feet from you, and it doesn't strike you as strange. And it's so trippy because I distinctly remember that to my young eyes he looked so old, like one of the older kids. And of course, looking at this picture now with my current eyes, that is no longer the case. But in the dream, strangely enough, I'm not surprised or curious as to why the King of Narnia is sitting in my rocking chair, clad in full armor, gazing at me intently. And at that point, really the only emotion I remember feeling was that of mild irritance. But I also felt a little self-conscious, in my pajamas, in the presence of such eminence, and I kept rolling over to go back to bed or back to sleep. But Peter Pevensey demanded my full attention, and he'd say, just another moment, and I'd begrudgingly refocus. And he was asking me all these questions about the lanky gray aliens. Have I ever seen more than one at a time? What are they doing? Do I see how they get here? Who are they with? What do they say to me? Do I know anyone else who can see them? What do they do to me? And I wasn't thinking too much about the answers, I just kind of kept saying no. I remember I told him that sometimes I imagine them playing the saxophone and that makes them less scary. And he liked that, he thought that was funny. And then Peter Pevensey got really empathetic. Like he's so sorry that this is happening and that we're going to get to the bottom of it and it isn't your fault and you're very brave and stuff like that. So I kind of played it off like any big kid would. Just like, oh, it's no big deal. And I recall being filled with a bit of pride. Like, oh, King Peter thinks I'm brave. Show me the lion. But at the same time, I was still kind of annoyed. Well, mostly because I was tired and wanted to go to bed, and this limey monarch wouldn't allow it. But I was also annoyed because I was fairly old by this point. Relatively speaking, of course. Too old to be scared of imaginary lanky gray aliens. So I was like, it's really not a big deal. And it was about at this point that I said to him, anyway, it's not like any of this is your fault. And he looked at me kind of sadly. And it was precisely at that point that he flickered. And strangely enough, in that moment, I realized that he'd been flickering the whole time. But I guess I only noticed it in that moment and then pieced it together or something. I don't know how to describe it better than that. But the second he looked at me sadly, in that instant, he flickered into the image of a far more familiar alien. I've literally never talked about this before, and it turns out that I really don't like talking about it, even sitting here with no one in front of me. But he flickered for a fraction of a second, like a strobe light. And it's just the most classic gray alien that's always depicted. And it's much more zoological than they're often depicted. It was a very fleshy looking thing. And by far the best representation is on the cover of Communion by Whitley Strieber. That's it. And I guarantee I had not seen that book or heard of that book at that point in my life. And yes, gray aliens were pretty common in pop culture, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say not like that. Not like this. Certainly not with the detail of just so animalistic or so flesh and blood. I don't know how to describe it better than that. And no offense whatsoever to new illustrator here, but this drawing does not do it justice. Does not do the thing in my dream justice. Though of course the same could be said for the lanky grays. But the small gray, the dream rocking chair gray, that was on a whole other level than the little day imaginations. Almost 20 years later, and I still remember every little detail of that. And like the mouth and eyes and neck are all very expressive. Thoughtful, I guess. And in the strobe, it like never moved. Not like it was being still when it strobed, but like in a snapshot. So like even if William Moseley was moving his arm or something, when it would flicker into Alien, it would be stock still. But then when it flickered back to William Moseley, the motion had continued as if it had never paused. So honestly, it was like watching a glitchy or laggy video game. When I watched this for like another minute, mostly Peter Pevensey looking very kind, but just with these random punctuations of this little humanoid doing the exact same thing. And like it took, who knows the secrets of dream time, but it took about a minute before I realized that I'm absolutely horrified. And I see on his resolute and regal face that he can tell something is wrong. And that's the last thing I remember before I blacked out. And it was like the kind of sleep where like you'd feel like you're tumbling forward, if you ever get that. It's like I see on his face that he thinks something is wrong. Then like I tumble forward into darkness and wake up. Quite relieved that the rocking chair wasn't in front of my bed. But I can tell you with 100% certainty that I'd never ever felt like how I woke up. I felt like electricity was pulsing through my spine and convulsing into my chest. And like my chest was being paddled by a defibrillator. I literally felt like my heart was not just pumping, but like it was moving back and forth in my chest, just like pounding my back and my front. And there was like this electric feeling. Like I felt like a battery. And then this is actually kind of funny in hindsight, I think. But believe it or not, that was the very first time in my entire life that I ever had acid reflux. You know, that burning, acidy feeling in the base of your throat? And for some reason, that was the most alarming part upon waking. My heart was banging and my body was buzzing, and I legitimately felt like there was a hole the size of a quarter being burned through my neck. And I was so alarmed by this that I sprang up and ran into my parents' room and described the pain. Because like I thought I was like dying. And my formerly asleep dad was like, "Take a Tums, what's wrong with you?" And I remember thinking, oh, that's what those are for. I didn't for a moment think it would work because it hurt so bad, but it did. And that's why they're called antacids. I don't know. It was a crazy dream. And then like in 2014 or 2015, which I refuse to believe is 10 years ago already, I was watching a show called The Dead Files, which is kind of a guilty pleasure of mine, especially during Halloween time. And it is a good show, or at least a fun show. It's an allegedly non-fiction show about a retired homicide detective and a psychic medium who separately investigate an alleged haunting, and then they see how similar their results are. And I think it's a really good show as far as the paranormal is concerned, because it doesn't get bogged down in the weeds as a ghost hunting show. Ghost hunting is absolutely ridiculous in my opinion, at least watching it on TV is. Like, you expect me to watch 42 minutes of a bunch of guys waiting to hear an off-camera, unidentifiable creak. And I'm not even knocking ghost hunting, but those shows are just dumb. The Dead Files is just like a homicide detective using his hard-earned people skills to gently interrogate alleged witnesses about their experiences, which I really enjoy watching. He's the skeptic, and it's very rare to have a lovable skeptic. And as for the non-skeptic, I really like, or at least respect, how she makes no attempt to explain herself or justify what she does. I'm inclined to say that psychics are abject bunk and con artists. And yet here I am talking about lanky gray aliens, so who on Earth or anywhere else am I to judge? Anyway, one day 10 years ago or so, I was 23-ish. It was around Halloween time and I was watching The Dead Files. It's background noise more than anything because I'm quite frightened of silence. And I was just casually listening as I was doing some cleaning. And the psychic, Amy, usually has an artist recreate one of the things she sees in her visages. And I remember quite vividly that I was trying to reach a book that had fallen behind the couch in such a way that denotes that I had yet to evolve to the level of tool user when I caught sight of her sketch. And it was one of those things where I found it funny because what the hell else was I supposed to do? This is what she had sketched after allegedly seeing it stalking a property in Rome, New York. Now, the sketch isn't exact, but it is pretty damn close to what I have called lanky gray aliens since I was 6 or 7. I have no idea exactly how old I was, but definitely before junior high. Then, this gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. But a weird thing that she got right and wrong is how the arm from the shoulder is too short compared to a person. She got right how short this is, shoulder to elbow. And now what she got wrong is that she drew the forearms way too long, which is forgivable because they seem long, but they're not. I think their forearms are the same length as a human's, but their hands are unreasonably long. Their wrist to fingertips is the same length as their elbow to wrist. So their hands are as big as their forearms, and that's an easy thing to miss for a sketch artist, or for someone who allegedly only saw them once, particularly because your attention is usually on their face. So for her sketch to be accurate to my understanding, the total length from elbow to fingertips is actually correct, but the hands would have to start, like, here. So, like, if I were to alter her sketch, I would have had the hands start here, but the same total length as she has. So she got the length of the appendage right, just more of it is hand and fingers, in my experience. And the reason I find this little incongruity so creepy is because I've been describing things to be illustrated for a long time now, and I can totally imagine her sitting with an illustrator, and she's thinking, the hands are longer and the forearms are shorter, but it's already been 2 hours, so that's close enough. Just a little detail that's not worth correcting, the kind that haunt my dreams before an upload. So I don't know if you follow on that one, but that's what it seems like to me, if she was indeed imagining the same thing that I imagined. I guess another difference between her version and mine is that I recall them being a bit fatter, I'd say. They like to stand with their elbows against their chest and wrap their forearms and creepy lanky fingers around their body, and their fingertips seem to reach their backs, which you can try right now if you let your arms hang neutrally at your side, but bend your elbows so that your hands are resting across your belly. Your hands should overlap a little bit, depending on how big your belly is, but their fingers wrap all the way behind their back, their fingertips at least. So as someone who's been working with illustrators for a long time, I can tell you that she came up with something pretty darn close to what I came up with. Come to think of it, she actually got one thing more right than I did, kind of. And that's that they do have spines, or ridges running down their back. But, because of their skin and faces, I've always kind of associated them as being iguana-like, or reptile-like. And it's not even that they look particularly reptilian. They don't have scales. It's more just like the way they move, and the way they leer with their eyes. So I had these kind of reptilian ridges drawn, but that's actually not really the case. They are kind of more just like vertebrae sticking up. You know, she also, I think, got the head size, head to body ratio closer than I did. But I don't think their chins are quite this pointy. I'm quite certain they don't have chins at all. You know, this is weird. I think this is the first video I've made where I've had an illustrator draw something that I've witnessed. It's more personal than describing what someone else saw. And another thing I can't help but notice is that I can't really tell you what they look like below the waist. I guess my imagination never really made that part up, even though I have distinct memories of visages of them walking in plain sight. And I can't help but notice that she kind of did the same thing. I want to be clear. I have always considered lanky gray aliens to be imagination. I've never seen them with my eyes, but I imagined them, like a reoccurring daydream or daymare. And therefore, they are just make-believe, and other things we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. I find it so fascinating how various nations have quietly conceded the fact that there are vehicles of non-human origin zipping about, and that according to Professor of Psychiatry Rick Strausman, all, not some or most, but all recipients of DMT envision otherworldly beings on their appropriately called trips, which is well and good and all and perfectly attributable to a mind-bending chemical, except for the fact that almost 70% of clinical participants experience the same type, or species, of entity. What are we supposed to do with that? I think most people can swallow the fact that there are crafts of inhuman origin inhabiting our airspace. I think it's the next step that people struggle with. At least I do. Because whatever or whoever's here, they're probably not here for the view. And certainly not for the affordable housing. Anyway, I don't know what to make of all this. I really don't. But anyway again, and as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.